Moldova was supposed to be easy prey, a small, poor, landlocked country sitting at the edge of Europe, stripped of major natural resources, and forced to carry the wreckage of the Soviet system long after the Soviet Union itself had collapsed and been buried. On paper, it looked exactly like the kind of place Moscow could intimidate forever, a nation too fragile to resist, too poor to build real alternatives, and too isolated to expect serious help from the outside world. In reality, that calculation is falling apart in front of the Kremlin's eyes, and it is falling apart in ways Moscow never fully anticipated. For years, Vladimir Putin treated Moldova less like a sovereign country and more like unfinished imperial business. Russia kept troops in Transnistria, backed networks of oligarchic influence, used energy as a weapon, and tried to turn every election cycle into a test of whether fear still worked better than hope. Moldova was supposed to stay weak, divided, and dependent. Instead, it kept moving in the opposite direction, slowly at first, and then with a momentum that is now almost impossible to reverse. That shift is no longer symbolic or rhetorical. On June 15, 2026, the European Union formally opened the first negotiation cluster in Moldova's accession process after the country met the required benchmarks, marking a real institutional step toward membership rather than another vague promise from Brussels. The conference was held in Luxembourg, and Ukraine sat at the same table that same day. Two neighboring countries, both under Russian pressure, both moving toward the same destination, side by side at the same table. It was one of the clearest images of how dramatically Russia's position in Eastern Europe has changed. That matters because for Moldova, Europe is not simply a lifestyle choice or a diplomatic preference. It is increasingly framed as a survival strategy. President Maia Sandu has said this openly, arguing that a small democracy under constant Russian pressure needs a larger political and economic shelter if it wants to endure. She repeated those words in Brussels just days later, saying Moldova has a rare window of opportunity and must use it quickly. That urgency is not theatrical. It reflects the genuine sense inside Chisinau that the current geopolitical moment will not last forever, and that every month of momentum matters. This is not just another Eastern European country knocking on the EU's door for prestige or trade benefits. This is a state that spent decades under the threat of political blackmail, energy coercion, and manufactured instability, and is now trying to build a future in which those tools stop working. Moldova is trying to lock in its western direction before the next storm hits. And the Kremlin understands exactly what that means. Moscow's pressure on Moldova was never limited to speeches or diplomatic insults. According to Moldovan intelligence claims that were reported over multiple election cycles, massive sums of dirty money were funneled into the country's politics to destabilize institutions and buy influence, while Russia's media networks and political proxies worked constantly to keep Moldova trapped inside a gray zone of dependency. The numbers involved were not small. Reported figures describe hundreds of millions of dollars in total across various operations, with one estimate placing Russian spending on a single disinformation campaign at around $350 million. And yet the election results still went the wrong way for Moscow. The pressure also came in a form that ordinary people could feel immediately and physically. Energy was always one of the Kremlin's sharpest tools. There is nothing abstract about the fear of freezing through a winter without gas, watching heating fail in hospitals, or seeing a government scramble to keep basic infrastructure alive, while a larger power twists the supply valve. Moldova experienced that pressure directly in the winter of 2025, when Russia shut off gas supplies in the middle of the cold season, in what was widely understood as a deliberate act of coercion. What happened next was not what Moscow expected. Rather than kneeling under energy pressure, Moldova accelerated its pivot toward European energy alternatives, cut its dependence on Russian gas, and moved quickly enough that Russian direct economic impact on Moldova reportedly dropped to a fraction of what it had been. The Kremlin had used its most reliable non-military lever, and the lever bent without the target breaking. A country that had long been described as a potential permanent to Russian energy politics suddenly demonstrated that independence was achievable, even under pressure, even without deep financial resources, and even while managing a frozen conflict on its own territory. That demonstration mattered not just for Moldova, but for every neighboring state watching the same dynamic play out. The EU accession opening reflects how seriously Brussels now treats Moldova's trajectory. The first cluster opened covers the fundamentals of governance, rule of law, judicial independence, anti-corruption frameworks, and human rights. In other words, the first formal gate on Moldova's road to EU membership is also the gate that tests whether the country can finally clean up the internal rot that Russia exploited for decades. It is the EU saying that the path to membership runs directly through institutional credibility, and that institutional credibility is also the best long-term defense against foreign interference. Brussels has also begun discussing the possibility of decoupling Moldova's accession track from Ukraine's if necessary. That is a significant shift. For a long time, Moldova's progress was tied to broader political blockages, especially because of Hungary's veto under Viktor Orbán, who served as the Kremlin's most useful institutional obstacle inside the EU for years. When Orbán lost the April 2026 election, and his successor Peter Magyar lifted the veto in exchange for Brussels releasing frozen funds, Russia's strongest point of leverage inside the EU machinery disappeared almost overnight. The road to Europe for both Moldova and Ukraine suddenly became far more open than it had been for years. Now, the discussion in Brussels is no longer whether Moldova can move at all. It is about how quickly Moldova can keep moving, and whether its pace needs to be protected from political slowdowns tied to other candidates. That change in framing is itself a strategic defeat for Moscow. The Kremlin spent years betting that even if Moldova drifted westward in theory, European internal divisions would keep progress slow enough to remain reversible. That bet is looking worse with every passing month. Still, Moldova's need for the EU is rooted not only in external threats, it is also a direct response to the country's own poisoned internal history. Moldova is Europe's poorest country by standard measures, with per capita income far below the EU average, an economy still heavily reliant on agriculture and remittances, and a demographic profile that many analysts describe with genuinely alarming language. Between 1 and 1.2 million citizens have left the country in the last 30 years. That number represents roughly a quarter of the entire working-age population. Educated young people leave. Businesses report labor shortages. The tax base shrinks. Analysts have used the phrase disappearing country, and it is not hyperbole. That demographic pressure hangs over everything else. When a state loses its most ambitious people to emigration, politics becomes a fight against exhaustion as much as against foreign interference. Every reform feels heavier. Every institutional failure feels more costly. Every year without improvement makes departure seem more rational. This is the cycle that EU membership is meant to interrupt, by making Moldova a place where structural funds arrive, where free movement actually helps retain talent rather than drain it, and where the promise of European markets creates enough economic activity to give people a reason to stay. The EU is already providing substantial support, including a nearly €2 billion multi-year package. But full membership would transform that support from useful external assistance into permanent institutional infrastructure. That difference matters enormously for a country that has watched external promises come and go without changing the underlying structure of daily life. Part of what makes institutional reform so urgent is Moldova's own past. The banking scandal of 2014, in which politicians and financial insiders effectively stole around $1 billion from the banking system, erasing roughly 12% of GDP in a single coordinated fraud, was not just an economic catastrophe. It was a demonstration of how thoroughly the state's institutions could be captured and hollowed out. The architect of that theft, Ilan Shor, now operates from Moscow and functions as an instrument of Kremlin influence. The oligarch era of Plahotniuk rotted the country's decision-making structures from within. The EU accession process offers Moldova an external framework with enough credibility and enforcement power to help dismantle that legacy in a way that purely domestic efforts never managed. And Shor has continued operating even from exile. Before the 2024 elections, his network ran a systematic vote-buying campaign inside Moldova, coordinated with AI-powered disinformation operations and amplified through Russia-controlled television channels that broadcast into Moldovan homes until the government began blocking them. An investigation published by Novaya Gazeta Europe in June 2026 described the financial infrastructure behind those operations in detail. More than 83 million euros in credit reportedly flowed to companies financing Shor-linked projects through structures connected to former Chelsea Football Club owner Roman Abramovich, with additional credit lines linked to companies associated with Arkady Rottenberg, described as a longtime associate of Putin. The financing network reportedly used payment mechanisms routed through Kyrgyzstan to avoid sanctions. Because those findings come from journalism rather than court verdicts, they should be understood as reported allegations, but they fit a larger pattern of hybrid interference that Moldovan authorities and Western intelligence assessments have consistently described. Russia's method in Moldova has been recognizable for years. Do not invade outright if you can fracture institutions from the inside. Do not always send tanks if you can buy parties, flood media spaces, frighten pensioners, and manufacture enough doubt and division to keep the country trapped between two futures without fully committing to either one. It is cheaper, deniable, and rarely triggers the kind of international response that open military aggression would provoke. But that method has started producing the opposite of its intended effect. Instead of making Moldovans resign themselves to Moscow's orbit, repeated and visible pressure campaigns have accelerated support for European integration. Public polling has consistently shown broad majority support for EU membership, particularly among younger and urban voters. The $350 million disinformation campaign that Russia reportedly ran during the election cycle did not prevent Maya Sandu from winning, did not prevent her party from maintaining its parliamentary majority, and did not stop EU support from rising rather than falling. Every visible act of interference strengthened the case for the very direction Moscow was trying to reverse. That dynamic is one of the central ironies of the entire situation. Russian hybrid warfare works best when it is invisible or deniable. When it becomes obvious, when it can be traced to specific financial networks, specific oligarchs, and specific operations, it loses its core function. It stops being a subtle influence campaign and becomes a public argument for why Moldova needs to leave Russia's orbit as fast as possible. And then there is Transnistria. That narrow strip of land along the Dniester River has been frozen in time for decades, a Soviet-style enclave sustained by Russian military presence, political patronage, and the sheer inertia of a conflict that never fully ended. Lenin statues stand in the streets. Hammer and sickle symbols mark the buildings. Soviet aesthetics survive in a place that the rest of the world moved past 30 years ago. It broke away from Moldova in 1992 after a brief and violent conflict, and has existed since then as a so-called state, internationally unrecognized but effectively controlled by Moscow. Transnistria was always more than a separatist dispute. It was a Kremlin lever, designed to keep Moldova permanently insecure, incomplete, and vulnerable to the implicit threat that the unresolved conflict could always be reignited. As long as Russian troops remained stationed there and the conflict stayed frozen, Moscow could imply at any moment that Moldova's sovereignty was conditional, that any westward move risked instability, and that any leader who pushed too hard might be pushing the country toward war. The military reality on the ground, however, has shifted in ways that are genuinely new. Russia is reportedly worried about the safety and isolation of its contingent in Transnistria, as supply routes have become increasingly restricted. Ukrainian forces have effectively cut Russia's land connection to the region, meaning that reinforcing or resupplying the roughly 1,500 troops deployed there is no longer a simple logistical operation. Without external support flowing freely, the contingent becomes less of a forward operating presence and more of a static garrison, slowly running out of options. Moldova has also taken direct legal steps to change the political status of the Russian military presence. After withdrawing from the Commonwealth of Independent States in April 2026, Moldovan authorities declared the command structure of the Russian operational group in Transnistria persona non grata, including the top commanders and their deputies. That move restricts their freedom of movement and severs the normal functioning of the chain of command. Any Russian officer trying to leave through Moldova faces detention. Any trying to exit through Ukraine faces a different kind of fate entirely. The command is effectively locked in place. That is a remarkable change from the situation that existed even a year earlier. A military presence that cannot be reinforced, cannot rotate its leadership, cannot receive reliable supplies, and cannot freely communicate with Moscow's broader military structure, is no longer a credible threat. It becomes a liability, a static problem that Russia has to manage, rather than a tool it can actively use. Moldovan authorities have quietly turned what was once described as a frozen conflict into what might more accurately be called a slowly collapsing one. The physical danger, however, remains real and serious. The Kobasna ammunition depot, located near the Ukrainian border in Transnistria, holds an estimated 20,000 tons of Soviet-era munitions, much of it well past its intended shelf life. The last international inspection on record took place in 2007. No outside organization has been allowed inside since then, and Russia has systematically rejected inspection requests, because access to the depot is one of the justifications for keeping troops in the region at all. Experts have warned for years that an accidental or deliberate detonation at Kobasna could produce a regional catastrophe. That risk has not disappeared. It has become more pressing as the isolation of the contingent deepens and the overall stability of the enclave deteriorates. The European Union has moved closer to addressing this problem directly. Earlier in 2026, Romania welcomed the EU's stated intention to formally demand the withdrawal of Russian troops from Transnistria, a demand that represents a meaningful escalation in the diplomatic framing of the issue. The debate inside EU institutions has shifted from treating Transnistria as a distant post-Soviet oddity to treating it as a concrete security problem that directly affects European borders. At the same time, no political resolution is close. Talks between Moldova and the separatist authorities in April produced no progress, according to Reuters reporting. Strategic momentum and diplomatic settlement are not the same thing, and the gap between them can remain wide for a long time. Chisinau's response has been to move toward a more assertive reintegration approach. A non-paper reportedly shared with Western partners in early 2026 outlined a strategy built on economic pressure, a phased integration timeline, an international civilian administration to replace the Russian-backed peacekeeping format, and a possible formula for joining the EU, while Transnistrian territory operates under a temporary suspension of EU law. That last element follows the precedent set by Cyprus, which joined the EU in 2004 while its northern territory remained under Turkish military control and outside the reach of central government. EU officials have confirmed that they consider this kind of arrangement possible for Moldova as well. The economic irony here is almost too sharp to ignore. Transnistria waves Soviet flags, maintains a Russian political identity, and refuses to recognize Moldova's authority. But 71% of its exports go to the EU market through arrangements linked to Moldova's association agreement with Brussels. The enclave built to resist Europe turns out to be commercially dependent on it. Russia's ideological outpost is selling to the West because there is nowhere else viable to sell. That economic reality gives Chisinau real leverage without requiring a single military action. The broader pattern extends far beyond Moldova's borders. Ukraine was the first massive shock to Putin's post-Soviet imperial logic. A country Russia tried to absorb by force and ended up binding more tightly to the West through its own resistance. Moldova is shaping up as the second kind of defeat, different in character but equally meaningful. Here Russia tried to win not through invasion, but through hybrid tools: money, energy, disinformation, frozen conflict, and political proxies. Those tools failed. They failed publicly, visibly, and in ways that made their failure instructive for every other country Russia is trying to influence by similar means. Hybrid warfare only looks cheap and effective when it works. When it fails, it reveals the attacker's intentions, demonstrates the limits of its leverage, and accelerates exactly the outcome it was designed to prevent. Moldova is becoming a case study in that reversal. Every visible Russian intrusion over the last few years has ended up making the argument for European integration stronger, not weaker. Armenia offers another data point. Prime Minister Pashinyan launched a sharp westward turn after what he described as Russia's betrayal during the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, joining the International Criminal Court, distancing his country from the Russia-led Collective Security Treaty Organization, and opening new security dialogues with the United States and France. Shore's network attempted to interfere in Armenian elections. That operation also failed. Georgia's situation is more complicated, with the government staying close to Moscow, while the population takes to the streets demanding EU membership. Even in Central Asia, Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan have begun shifting toward more multilateral foreign policy positions, quietly pushing back against Moscow's assumption that its near abroad is still predictable territory. The cumulative picture is of a sphere of influence that is not merely shrinking, but actively losing its internal logic. Countries that were supposed to remain inside Russia's orbit by structural necessity are finding paths out, one by one, through different combinations of strategy, resistance, and outside support. Moldova is the symbol country for that collapse. The smallest, poorest, most exposed former Soviet republic, the one that should have been easiest to keep in line, now locking itself into the Western institutional architecture as fast as its capacity allows. But the obstacles ahead are real, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. EU accession is not a short process, and Moldova's target of being ready for membership by around 2030 is described by many experts as ambitious. Negotiations across dozens of policy chapters require an enormous institutional transformation for a country with Moldova's administrative capacity and financial resources. The areas the EU monitors most carefully, judicial independence, anti-corruption, rule of law, are also the areas where Moldova's past is most damaging and where progress is most difficult to sustain. There are also complications inside Europe. Enlargement fatigue is a genuine force, not just a political talking point. Not every EU member state moves with urgency toward accepting new members, and Moldova's poverty and the unresolved Transnistria question give hesitant governments real arguments for slowing things down. Even the June breakthrough, real as it is, does not eliminate those structural tensions. The unification question adds a further layer of complexity. Polls in Romania in 2026 have shown strong majority support for union with Moldova in several surveys, with one study putting the figure at nearly 70%. In Moldova, by contrast, the picture is far more divided. Support has been rising, and some surveys now show more Moldovans in favor than opposed. But the margin is much narrower and varies significantly, depending on how questions are framed. which communities are included, and how the diaspora is counted. Minority populations, including the Gagauz community in southern Moldova, have shown much lower support, and the potential constitutional complications of merging 2 legal systems, 2 governance structures, and 3 officially recognized language communities into a single state make this anything but a straightforward process. Maya Sandu added a new dimension to that debate in early 2026 when she announced she would personally vote in favor of union with Romania if a referendum were organized, while simultaneously making clear that no such majority currently exists inside Moldova. Romanian President Nicolae Ciucă said Romania would be ready if Moldovans chose that path, but stopped short of pushing for a formal process. For now, union remains what it has been, a serious topic of public discussion, an emotional undercurrent, and a potential Plan B if EU accession stalls, rather than an operational policy with a concrete timeline. There is also the question of what happens after Sandu. Moldova's westward orientation has been built substantially on her personal political will, her credibility with European partners, and her ability to hold together a reform coalition against sustained Russian pressure. The institutions she has worked to build are still fragile. The pro-Russian opposition, including the Socialist Party led by former President Igor Dodon, still holds a meaningful share of the electorate, and would pursue a very different foreign policy if it ever returned to power. The question of whether Moldova's European direction can survive a change in leadership without reversing is one of the most important unresolved questions in the entire story. But that question itself illuminates the stakes of the current moment. The reason speed matters, the reason Sandu keeps talking about windows of opportunity, the reason EU officials are discussing faster timelines and decoupled tracks, is precisely because everyone involved understands that the current conditions will not last forever. Embedding Moldova in EU structures, trade relationships, legal frameworks, and security arrangements while the window is open makes reversal progressively harder. Each cluster opened, each reform implemented, each section of infrastructure connected to European networks adds another layer of irreversibility to a choice that Russia is still trying to make reversible. Fear does not work indefinitely. That may be the simplest and most important lesson from what has happened in Moldova over the last several years. Russia built its regional influence on the assumption that small, poor, isolated countries would remain too afraid to resist, afraid of energy cutoffs, afraid of frozen conflicts unfreezing, afraid of economic retaliation, afraid of political destabilization. Moldova absorbed all of that pressure and kept moving anyway. Not without cost, not without vulnerability, not without risk, but moving. That is the defeat the Kremlin cannot easily absorb. Not just the loss of a country it expected to control, but the loss of the fear that was supposed to guarantee that control. Moldova stopped being afraid. And the moment that became visible to every other country watching from the edges of Russia's shrinking sphere of influence, the calculus in every one of those capitals changed just a little bit more. The road ahead for Moldova is still hard. Corruption has not been eliminated. Transnistria remains unresolved. EU membership requires years of grinding institutional work that will test state capacity at every step. But after June 2026, the question is no longer whether Moldova has chosen a direction. The question is whether anyone can still force it to turn around. Right now, the honest answer to that question looks more like no than it has at any point in the last 30 years.